The Silkworms by Janet Frame. If only, he thought, I were God looking from my door upon completeness before I die. He was not old, only 55. His hair was thin and faded like desert grass, flattened by secret pressures from the sky. His head was land. Within it he felled forests of beech, rimu, kauri, burned with the scrub, hacked manuka for fences, measured and set the boundaries for paddocks. Poor Edgar, the neighbors said. The past has sprinkled salt on his tail, has trapped him in an important flight. Only it was not that way at all. He was not a bird. Was he a cat, then? Had he swallowed the past, licking it from his life as a cat licks its fur until it winds into a ball inside, compact, soft, a nest ball that causes pain? Oh, whatever was the matter with Edgar? Cat, bird, human being, it was yesterday that was the matter, and it was no use saying to him, "Don't groom your memory day after day on the hearth until you swallow it and it hurts you, stops your life." Every morning he sunbathed, lying naked on the rug beside the east wall of the house, only a few feet away from the tomatoes, the stout Russian variety, the clump of garlic, the potatoes numerously leaved like Bibles with the small, bloodless fruit beneath, the swollen veined cabbages, airy parsley. He sunbathed for an hour, taking stock of the sun and the secret growth of his vegetables. Then he would go inside, dress, and, using a pencil upon green paper because green was said to be kind to the eyes, he would sit at his homemade table to write his work of literature. He leaned over the table, his shoulders hunched, his face tensed, as if he were in a lavatory. The words came dropping from him, tight and round and hard. The compressed words came dropping slowly from him like childhood bullets. All morning he worked, writing, crossing out, writing again, and afterwards typing the fragment he had made, adding it to the pile of green sheets, counting them carefully, reckoning how many more he must squeeze from his head before he completed the work of literature. Sometimes, when he was reluctant to begin working, he would sit on the stool near his kitchen window and look out at the postman passing, throwing the letters in the old biscuit tin which Edgar had put inside the hedge as letterbox, at the paper boy cycling by, aiming the paper through the gap in the hedge that served as a gate onto the narrow path. Or he would watch people hurrying to work to catch the bus and ferry to the city. He would see his next-door neighbor, whose face, on Mondays, had a satisfied expression. Had he not mowed the lawn on the weekend with the new electric mower, cut down a troublesome tree in his garden with his new electric saw, built a kitchen table for his wife from the do-it-yourself kit, and then had time to spend with the whole of Sunday afternoon with his wife and 3 children at one of the East Coast bays? His father, who lived in the little self-contained hut on the property, had not accompanied them. He was growing old. He was better at home in the sun with a handkerchief over his face. Edgar looked from his window and saw the past. He had known the area when he was a child. He could not accept the cutting back of the bush, nor the rows of white-toothed villas biting into the beach where he had once played under the Pocatawa trees, and where, in the Depression days, he had roamed the sand in search of food, cabbages, onions, cast overboard from the trading vessels. So he lived alone in his house. He grew his hedge high. He pursued his work of literature. "It must be that I'm growing old," he said to himself. It was breakfast time. He had sunbathed and was drinking a cup of tea while he read The Critique of Pure Reason, propping the book against a half-filled jar of preserved peaches. "It's strange about the forest in my head," he thought. "I remember it. Down in the King's country on holiday, I went into the farm kitchen and they said to me, 'What is that terrible look on your face?' They demanded to know, as if my seeing the bushfire had collected a fortune which showed in my face and which caused them to fear and envy that it was not their prize also. 'Come on, what is that terrible look on your face?' 'Own up,' they were saying, 'own up, where is the gold mine?' I cried. I never knew what the look was. Have I a look on my face now? If so, is it not fear at seeing my flesh perish, my leaves slowly writhe in the grip of fire and progress? He who desires completeness is against progress. There is no completeness while time continues to provide a future. I have an engineering look on my face now, a scientific look. In the South, after the earthquake, they rebuilt the city and reclaimed the land which the shock cast up from the sea. I am reclaiming a certain completeness before I die. Does the sun twist the necks of sunflowers like a screw-up top-down vision to preserve the molten fruit? When I was a boy, I kept silkworms from their birth to their death. Therefore, one day Edgar put on his best pants, tied with a string at the waist, his gray pullover, his Roman sandals, and his old stained gabardine, and traveled in the bay bus down to the harbor. He bought his ticket for the ferry, and sitting outside in the sun, he crossed the harbor to the abominable city, where he brought 12 silkworms in a small cardboard box from the pet shop in the street next to the main street. In the main street were the fashionable stores. Then came, like the other side of the moon, the coin, the dream, the places which sold second-hand clothing, men's crumpled, collapsed suits, women's shapeless floral dresses, to which time and the salt-filled light of the harbor sun had given a mimic sheen of newness, a wild brightness, as if a lifetime were crushed between the two streets, like wheat between stones. The pet shop was next to a second-hand dealer's, and a vacant shop with the door boarded up and the windows broken in a star shape, revealing that the core of darkness, which centers itself in holes, gaps of light, the beginning of tunnels, and open doorways at night. The silkworms had been thriving in the window of the pet shop, next to the odorous guinea pigs and white mice with rosebud skin. Edgar bought 12 silkworms in a small cardboard box, and returning immediately to the ferry wharf, he boarded the next ferry across the harbor and was soon home, collecting on the way a bigger cardboard box from the dairy at the corner of his street. It must be done, Edgar thought, exactly as it was when I was a child. I am in my middle 50s, he said. I am alone, he said. I have loved and lost and won. I am not a biblical character. I have no issue. Most of his friends were married and had borne children who, in their turn, had borne children in historic continuity. He felt himself omitted from history, as if in taking up with the marching generations in the beginning of his life, he had journeyed so far and then been trapped in a pothole up to his neck. His head mattered. The bushfires in his head, his work of literature, his reading, and now the silkworms through which he could control history itself, birth, copulation, death. He put the silkworms in their chocolate box and went thoughtfully out to the garden. He stroked the plump tomatoes, already striped with yellow. He lifted the leaves of the wandering Chinese gooseberry and considered the hairy ball shape. The real sign of age, he thought, is when you lean over and your balls hang down as far as the earth. He crossed then to the 2 pawpaw trees. He had never grown pawpaws until now. He hoped that soon they would produce fruit. Meanwhile, they needed help. One was male, the other female. There was no communication between them apart from the haphazard dancing of bees who did not understand at all. Very carefully, Edgar removed pollen from the stamen of the male tree and performed his daily task of fertilizing the female pawpaw. When it bears fruit, he said, I will eat the fruit for breakfast while I read The Fairy Queen or The Critique of Pure Reason or Gibbon's Decline and Fall. Before I die, he said, I will get once more through Gibbon. The pawpaw contracted a terrible disease. Its leaves withered from the edges toward the heart of the leaf. Its young trunk was encrusted with silver scales. It was playing host to a species of death. Edgar went up to the house and sat all day at his desk. He was so bewildered that he could write nothing. But there were still the silkworms. They were flourishing now. Edgar had canvassed the neighbors for mulberry leaves. Excuse me, I noticed you have a mulberry tree in your garden. I wonder, would you be so kind as to supply me with the leaves? Have your children started keeping silkworms too? Yes, for silkworms. It's not as if they supply much silk. Would you then be so kind? I will try not to disturb you when I call. The women had looked hard at Edgar. trying to sum him up. He seemed a disreputable character, and one didn't want such people coming back and forth in one's garden with the excuse of gathering mulberry leaves for silkworms. On the other hand, some folk who looked disreputable often turned out to be quite distinguished, well-known, with talks over the radio and invitations to cocktail parties in the university set. Oh, how was one to know? The woman looked still harder at Edgar. She decided that he was disreputable. Yet, with a feeling of being generous, she said, "Of course you can have the mulberry leaves." She thought, "The silkworms don't live all that long." She sighed. "Why isn't it planned for us?" So Edgar found his supply of leaves for the silkworms. The female pawpaw tree died. Edgar dug it out, removed the tiny shriveled fruit to show to friends, "My pawpaws, my first ever," and burned the tree in the rubbish fire at the bottom of the garden. The orange tree and the lemon tree bore their glowing lamps to the funeral. When night came, the smoke still hung in the air, and the crickets and grasshoppers continued their nether song for strings. "I am in my middle 50s, Edgar said. "I have no issue." He put out the flames, for the world at night must be made safe from fire, and he went inside to bed. The silkworms were in their box on the table in the kitchen next to his bedroom. Even from where he lay, he could hear them at their compulsive, continuous, desperate meal, a giant sound in the night as if crackling twigs and breaking boughs. Edgar dared to calculate the level of commotion were the silkworms the size of men. He shuddered at the noise of the falling world. He got out of bed, went to the silkworms, and, lifting one of them onto the table, he squashed it with the end of a spoon. A green stain oozed from it. Disgusted, he threw the dead worm in the tin under the sink where he kept the scraps and the used tea leaves. Then, with the noise of the marathon meal echoing and swelling about him, he returned to his bed, buttoned the top button of the old gray shirt that he wore at night, and lay on his back, stiffly, with the skin of his face damp, slowly relaxing into the erased mask of sleep, where people who witness it like to impress a fancied innocence, not realizing that for the night the years of experience have retired within to rage their havoc among dreams. And while Edgar slept, how transparent his eyelids seemed, like gateways to alternate sight, and see at the corner of his mouth the tiny stream of saliva flowing from its source in the dark cavern. The silkworms, wide awake, pursued their frenzied meal. The noise of the tireless mandibles pierced Edgar's sleep, entered like clashing swords into each dream, and Edgar had many dreams that night. He dreamed of his garden, the tomatoes, the Chinese gooseberries, the 2 pawpaw fruits, and the diseased tree. He dreamed of his work of literature, of bushfires, gold mines, of postmen who cast a lichen over each letter in order to prevent him from opening. It changed to an oyster growth. His fingers bled, touching the sharp shells. He was under the sea, safe from fire. One side of his face was diseased. One side of his body was diseased. Only his balls hung like pearls. There was a noise of machines. The sea dried. The salt stayed in heaps, tall as mountains. The quick motion trees sprang into growth. The machines commenced their meal, eating through driftwood houses and trees with their tops in the sky, swallowing shadows and the sun, but the sun stuck in their crops. They burned to death. Lily Hogan has a dress of silk. Some people save. I could never save. I kept silkworms. Why do you choose green leaves to write your work of literature? Do you not realize the danger to green leaves with silkworms in the house? He woke, sweating. The 172 pages were in order. Safe. Edgar's friends came to visit him at night. He stood, separated from them by the table, and lectured to them on the devouring evils of progress, on Russian tomatoes, Gibbon's decline and fall, misplaced power stations, the real distance between the head and the tail of a serpent, or cycle, and silkworms. One evening, they noticed that he was winding sheets of his green writing paper into cone shapes. The silkworms have shed their skins the required number of times, he said. I noticed that one of them has begun to wave its head about and shed from its jaws a thin thread of gold silk. You see? he said, continuing his excited, important manner. "It is ready to weave. I shall drop the silkworms one by one onto these cones of paper, attach each one to the wall by a pin, and let the silkworms complete their spinning. Soon they will disappear in a cloud of golden silk, and lie in hiding. I shall unwind their silk." He was yesterday. It was a lesson he had learned. He was repeating it. Edgar's friends watched him in embarrassed dismay. He was a bow-tied courier who had learned the language, although he no longer lived in the country. He was conducting them as tourists through the territory of his past, without apparently realizing that it had changed, that all things, visible or invisible, are only shadows, attending shapes of the change under the sun of time. They shrivel like shadows of two pawpaws at noon. But of course Edgar knew this. Edgar was wise. He continued his lecture, pinning the cone shapes to the wall beneath a Christmas card from Spain, which said, "Pax Pa." Some days later, when the silkworms had finished spinning and were settled into their cocoons with doors and windows shut, and had changed to pupae, Edgar unwound the silk from each one onto strips of cardboard, and each time as he reached the boudoir of the end of the maze was confronted by the naked, black-eyed, unseemly monster who trembled and shrank from his couch. The sensitivity alarmed him. What was its purpose? A fly might brush its own cheek, rain fall upon his skin. He could walk into rooms, bumping into furniture, enduring the hazards and encounters of the living and the dead, yet not flinch or shrink. By what right was the chrysalis so privileged in sensitivity? Why did it recoil from him? Nevertheless, in spite of his envy, very gently he wrapped the cruelly exposed pupae in cotton wool, placed them once again in the chocolate box from which he had cleaned the waste, and left them in peace. Was it peace? Until they could emerge as moths. He was relieved to not have to look upon the ugly, sensitive creatures while they accomplished their metamorphosis. Then, one morning, when he decided to unwrap one of them from its cotton wool, he found that the welted boot-polished brown tough skin had hardened and shriveled, and a moth lay on the soft white bed, its beautifully patterned wings circles of dark suns, limp, fresh, and moist. In all, 9 moths had emerged. 2 of the pupae had kept their original shape, tapering at both ends, like coffins, one of which enclosed a dead half-moth, the other nothing. Tenderly, Edgar picked up the 9 moths and put them in another box, where soon the males crawled towards the females, and all were paired except the odd one, which stayed in a corner, feebly trying out the wings which it would never use for flight. Hours passed, and still the moths clung together. Then, as night came, each male moth fell from its mate and died. Its wings, now sheenless and crumpled, with the slight strength remaining to them, the female moths crawled upon the small sheets of cardboard which Edgar provided for each one, and soon the eggs, in neat rows, like tiny white running stitches, were laid upon the cardboard, and then, one by one, the female moths also died, with the glitter dust rubbed from their wings. Had they known that wings are for flying? Edgar had stayed by them in their travail of lust and their death. They had no towers in their heads, he was aware of that, nor lighthouses to guide the homing thoughts, nor wrecked thoughts dismantled by the imperative tides coming and going to trade salt, and tears in all 4 corners of breathing, feeling, and knowing. The sordid spectacle depressed him at last. Why had the chrysalis been so responsive, and the wings so beautifully patterned? Why had there been wings at all? But it was the cycle. It was the completeness. Nothing has changed, Edgar said. What new event is written into their history? None. Where is their future? Nowhere. Are they against or for progress? It was dark when Edgar took the box outside down to the rubbish heap and sprinkled the dead moths upon the ashes of the diseased pawpaw. Then, carrying the sheets of cardboard with their tiny fertile full stops, ends of chapters, heads beneath the exclamatory swords, tiny marks standing waist high above the embryo semicolon, he went into the garden, dug a hole, and buried the eggs. When the hot weather comes, he said to himself, I will dig them up and hatch out the new silkworms in the sun, get more mulberry leaves, another chocolate box. He went inside the house, and unwinding each thread of silk, he began to plait all the threads. Masked, their gold acquire a languor and sheen. He hung the plaited silk rope upon the wall beneath the Spanish Christmas card which said, Paw Paw. That's all, he said. I have stood in the doorway, like God. I kept silkworms when I was a child. Nothing has changed. The bushfire still burns and the people cry for the share of it which they see in my face. Where did you get that terrible look on your face? What have you seen? Tell us quickly. There is no new magic. Where is the gold mine? What are we doing with ourselves? Birth, copulation, and death, and no use to make of our wings? When Edgar had buried the eggs, he went to his bedroom, put on his gray shirt, and got into bed. He slept deeply, without dreams that cared to acknowledge themselves in his waking curiosity. And the next morning, he woke, sunbathed at the east wall, read the Critique of Pure Reason, propping it against the sugar bowl, and then sat at his table with the leaf-green sheets of paper before him and his HB pencil sharpened in his hand. It should be satisfied now, he said, and looked at the mass of plaited silk burnished by the sun. Then the fire raced through the forest, and chains swung from the sky. He leaned his head in his hands. If only, he thought, I were God, looking from my door upon completeness.